This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
The Eagle is back after a short spring hiatus. Did you miss us? I'm Jessica Marshall, and we are going to jump right back into the swing of things here on the Times-Union's weekly news podcast. We'll start off with something that I'm willing to bet may be close to the top of your list of greatest fears. It's on mine. What if I go in for a surgery and the medical team leaves something in there before closing me up? It's extremely rare, but it does happen. Times-Union investigative reporter Emilie Munson has been looking at cases where this has happened throughout the United States. She joins me now on the Eagle to talk through what she's learned. Just a little warning up front, we are talking about surgery here, so things could get a little visceral. If you're squeamish, you may not love some of the discussion in this next segment, but I do promise it's not too graphic. I have actually fainted at the sight of blood before, and I did not have any trouble with what we talk about here, but just warning you. I have had a couple of surgeries in my lifetime, and I have to be honest in saying that, besides fearing dying on the table, my next biggest fear was that they would leave something inside of me because no real rational reason, I don't think. It's not like I did research and was like, oh, they're leaving things in people left and right. But it was still just a fear. It just came up. But what you found out in this recent reporting is that it actually does happen. So yeah, let's start there. How often does it happen that a doctor or member of the surgery staff would leave something in a patient and then sew them back up? Just how often does that happen?
This is a rare event, but it does happen. And it's something that medical professionals have agreed should never happen. So even a few cases are troubling. And let me try to put that in a bit more perspective for you. There are millions of surgeries every year in the US. The best estimates that we have suggest that there are about 1,500 of these cases per year, maybe a little more than that. We, as reporters at Hearst, put a lot of time into exploring how many cases there were per year. We collected data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on cases among Medicare patients. And then we also tried to get as much data as we could from state health departments, many of whom track this. And in 2022, we found more than 650 cases in that year. It's hard to exactly pinpoint how many cases there are per year because there's no one entity that is collecting data on all of these cases nationwide.
Now, you obviously, as part of that, also talked to people to whom this happened, right? People had some really alarming stories. So, how does that fit into the reporting that you did?
Yeah, we interviewed a number of patients who experienced this. Let me tell you about the case of one of the patients who I spoke with. Her name is Emilie Acosta, and she had a surgery in 2018 in Texas where a sponge was left behind in her abdomen accidentally during the surgery.
Well, I want to interrupt you there just one second, just so we can make sure that people following along know kind of what a sponge is. So, like, a sponge is, from my understanding, kind of a piece of material that's used to absorb like fluid during surgery. Is that accurate? Like, what do you do with a sponge?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So a lot of these abdominal surgeries they may have a lot of blood in the surgery or other fluids. And so these fabrics are used for absorption primarily. And if you saw a picture of these quote unquote sponges and you're not a medical professional, you might say that, oh, that looks a little bit more like a towel or a piece of gauze. We're not talking about a kitchen sponge here.
Yeah, the visual is important, I guess, in this case.
Exactly, exactly. Basically, this sponge was left in the patient Emilie's body for 9 months after her surgery. Her wound from her surgery just wasn't healing properly after the surgery. She was also feeling pain and tenderness in her abdomen and some other symptoms. And she was going to her doctor about these symptoms, but the cause wasn't located by that doctor. So eventually she got a second opinion. And the second doctor took a look at her CT scan and noticed that there was something unusual appearing on the scan. And you could actually see on the scan this curving shape of an S, which was this special thread that they put in sponges to allow them to be detected in medical imaging, like X-rays and CT scans.
In
Um,
case this very thing happens, right?
in case this very thing happens to allow you to see it. So he saw the sponge and then she ended up having another procedure to remove it from her body.
So this particular woman that you spoke to who had the sponge left, what happened to her after her surgery, right? Did she pursue some kind of like legal action over this?
Yeah, after her surgery, she did sue the hospital and the medical professionals who were involved, and eventually she did get a jury decision against some of the medical professionals who were involved. Not all of them were found negligent.
So is this a common outcome for people who, have found that objects have been left inside of them? Is that something that happens a lot? They figured out what the problem is and then there's legal action afterward? Is that kind of the norm or?
It's hard to say exactly what is the norm because we don't even know exactly how many cases happen per year, never mind how many of them result in a lawsuit. But in speaking with people who have gone through this and speaking with medical malpractice attorneys, these kinds of cases do often result in a medical malpractice lawsuit. And many times the plaintiff is successful in obtaining some kind of damages from um, the hospital or the providers after one of these incidents occurs.
I want to kind of go back to the objects, right? We talked about a sponge. In your research, the cases that you've looked at and the data that you've seen, what else gets left in there? Like, what else is there to worry about?
Yeah, we learned about cases where tools like scalpels, retractors were left behind in patients. Also, tool or device fragments. Envision that a surgeon is using a tool during a surgery, and then a little tiny piece of it breaks off during the surgery, and that little fragment might be left behind. We learned about cases where needles were left behind in patients, either whole or broken pieces of those needles, guide wires, catheters, drill bits. We interviewed the director of the Minnesota Department of Health's adverse events reporting system. This is someone whose whole job it is to track serious medical errors like these kinds of errors. And what she told us was that over time, there has been a reduction in the number of cases that involve whole tools. And it's a little bit more common now for cases to involve pieces of tools, small fragments. So that's a positive step, right? Where we're reducing the number of these really large items left behind and catching more of those cases, right?
I mean, I'm still terrified, but but as you said, it's, when looking at what you looked at or the data that you had access to, it is still pretty rare, but it's still also a problem. So what, I guess, is being done to mitigate these types of cases? Is there, any action toward implementing new preventative measures or anything along those lines? Like, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me first describe for you what is kind of the standard method that's used for prevention. During surgery, it is common pretty much universally that there will be a nurse and perhaps a scrub tech as well who are responsible for counting the items that are being used in the surgery, the tools, the sponges, perhaps other items. And they count each item that goes into use in the surgery. And then they are also responsible for making sure each of those items is counted at the end of the surgery so that you start and end the surgery with the same number of items. There are different strategies used for this count, but in a lot of places, this is a manual process where a person is literally, counting things by hand and maybe recording the count on something like a whiteboard. Now, what we found is that there are technologies that can assist with this, but they're not necessarily being used everywhere. The reason why manual counting is not good enough is really because the people doing these counts are human. Humans make errors, even when you're trying to be really focused. But consider that the operating room is a place where there's a lot of things going on, perhaps at once. Emergencies can crop up during the process of a surgery. There's a lot of distractions, and there can be communications errors. And so that can mean that if you're trying to manually count on something, you could make an error and you think that you counted everything that you should have, but in fact, you may have missed one. And that's very common in these cases. And so technology can help with this. There are things like RFID scanners that can be used to scan each sponge at the beginning of the surgery and at the end of the surgery so that the technology ensures that each sponge was indeed counted.
Same idea as, like, you put the RFID tags on your luggage when you fly, and if your luggage gets lost, you know where it is. That's the same thing, right?
Yeah, same general concept. Exactly. That's the same kind of technology. And so there's multiple technologies like these that can be used, but they're not used everywhere for a variety of reasons. It can be costly to add this kind of technology to potentially every operating room in a hospital. And these cases, while they are extremely serious and can be extremely expensive for the hospital when they do occur, they are not happening every day at a hospital. So, these facilities are, trying to balance the cost of the preventative measures versus the cost of one of these incidents when they do occur.
Isn't there also, because in your article, one of the things I found really interesting was one of the doctors that you spoke to was talking about how kind of naturally these incidents have lessened because of advances in technology with surgery, right? Like robotic surgery and like different things that tech has just changed about surgery in general. Is that, can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, that's correct. So over the last 2 or 3 decades, surgery in the US has changed a lot. There is an increase in more minimally invasive procedures, the use of robots and other technologies, and fewer surgeries, resulting in large incisions in the patients, if you will, fewer large open surgeries, and more surgeries that just have a very tiny incision in the patient. And of course, when you're doing that, you're reducing the risk that something is going to be left behind, because the research shows that the cases that are most at risk for an object being left behind are cases with a large open incision. Often those are cases that are thoracic cases, the chest area, the abdomen area.
Is there a demographic of people that this happens to more than others, or demographics, plural, that make people more vulnerable to something like this?
Yes, the research has showed that patients who are Medicare patients are at increased risk of experiencing one of these events. And also patients who are obese have been found to be at increased risk of experiencing an item left behind.
Is there a particular reason for those two populations?
Obese patients have larger body mass, literally a physically larger body in which an object could be left behind than a person with a physically smaller body. For Medicare patients, that is a little bit more complicated. These Medicare patients are often age 65 and older. Those patients are typically getting more surgeries than younger patients.
Are you going to be doing more reporting on this going forward? Are you going to have more, search for more data?
We are going to be doing more reporting on this topic, and we're going to be looking into other kinds of never events. Never events are these groups of serious medical errors and other similar adverse health events that medical professionals agree should not happen. These are very shocking errors, and many of them are preventable. And these are things like medication errors that results in the patient being injured or dying. Cases like someone being artificially inseminated with the wrong egg or the wrong sperm, the wrong patient receiving surgery, or a patient getting surgery on the wrong part of their body.
All of the things that I am terrified of when I contemplate having surgery.
Yeah. So we'll be looking further at this larger group of medical errors. And if you're listening to this podcast and you experienced an event like this, please get in touch. We would love to hear your story.
As Emilie said, if you've been a victim of a medical error, head over to timesunion.com and check out her story. There's a form on there that you can fill out to get in contact with her. Also, in Emilie's piece on timesunion.com, you can look up whether your local hospital in New York may have had any incidents of items left in patients after surgery. We're going to take a short break now, but when we return, we're going to talk again about the possibility of buying wine in New York grocery stores.
Why is healthcare so expensive? What's happening with climate change? And are elections safe? You can find answers to those questions and a lot more with Capitol Confidential from me, Dan Clark. I give you the latest news and analysis from the state capitol and beyond. Sign up now at capitolconfidential.com. That's Capitol with an O, confidential.com.
"12-year-old Jaliek Rainwalker vanished without a trace from a small upstate New York village on a cool November night in 2007. His adoptive parents say he ran away. Police believe he was murdered, but a body has never been found, and a suspect has never been named.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah,
Appreciate
okay,
that.
all right, but you don't want to talk.
Then when I learned they were trying to undo the adoption, that's when I learned that this story was very complicated, well, a lot more complicated than I even thought.
Almost 2 decades later, the case remains unsolved. I'm Jessica Marshall.
And I'm Wendy Libertor.
In this podcast from the Times-Union, we take a deep dive into the mystery of this missing child and try to find some answers.
So have you come to terms that Jalik is probably dead?
Yes.
Okay.
I feel that he was killed on November 1st, 2007.
Available now, wherever you listen to podcasts.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times-Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times-Union subscriber today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Eagle, a Times-Union podcast. I'm Jessica Marshall. A few episodes back, the Times-Union's Steve Barnes interviewed a liquor store owner for his take on whether New York should allow grocery stores to sell wine. The pros and cons of it have been debated for literally decades. But with a little more momentum than usual this year, Steve's been gathering opinions on the matter. This week on The Eagle, he's joined by an expert in addiction policy and how he is looking at the prospect of wine in grocery stores in New York.
We are here today talking to Rob Kent, who is a specialist and consultant in healthcare policy, particularly as it relates to addiction. He has a firm in Virginia after 2 years in addiction policy in the White House, the Biden White House. Prior to that, he spent 13 years as general counsel to the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Supports and lived in the Capital Region for many years. Rob, I wanted to talk to you about wine in supermarkets, commonly known as wine and grocery stores or WIGs. Most of the opposition we hear to its potential passage this legislative session in New York is from the liquor store lobby, who worried that their clients would be undercut on prices because they couldn't compete and they might go out of business. But you have a different concern. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, and to be clear, Steve, I'm not saying I'm opposed or supportive. It's more just if you're going to consider these types of actions, think it through and think about all the repercussions and make policy in a broad way. So my concern is more about the more you increase access to alcohol, the more likely you are to end up with people who have dangerous use of the alcohol to the point where they need medical help and including treatment for addiction. And if you're going to enact these kinds of laws, you should assume it will increase the number of folks who need help. And you're doing it to an addiction care system overseen by Oasis that already struggles right now to handle what, the folks that come through the door. So if you're going to do this, do it in a way that adds additional financial resources to the Oasis system so they can handle what will come.
Well, have you seen numbers that confirm that by expanding the availability of wine to supermarkets that there would then be an increase? Or is this for you a logical presupposition based on the fact that if there are thousands of more places to buy alcohol, to buy wine, that more people will drink it.
I think it's more the latter, and but understand as well current numbers. Nationally, the folks who compile the statistics say that about 178,000 people die a year with alcohol-related causes.
And how does that stack up, if I may, against if you count in opioids, if you count in anything else for all other addictions, is alcohol far outweighs them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the number of opioid overdose deaths, and thankfully it's gone down in the last year. Hopefully it's a trend and not just an anomaly. But nationally, it was still about 85,000 people. So 178,000 versus 85,000. And the other piece, so in New York, when I was at Oasis, except for maybe a few years in like the 2015, 16 area, where opioids caught up to alcohol is the number one reason people seek admission for treatment, alcohol has always been the number one reason people go to get help. It's between 40 and 50% of the admissions to the Oasis treatment system. And based on numbers I've seen that other people have put out, other advocates, there's about 8,000 deaths a year, alcohol-related deaths in New York. And right now, the current numbers for opioids is about 5,600.
What would you advocate for here? Because nowhere in the current WIGS legislation does it have anything to say about treatment or education or anything like that. Do you think that belongs in the bill, or would you prefer that there were, at the same time, an acknowledgement of this change, there be more funds allocated for treatment and education?
Yeah, so, alcohol, like everything else in New York, is taxed. And so assume there's going to be an increased amount of revenue coming in if you increase the number of facilities that can sell it, wine in particular. So dedicate some of the tax revenue that comes in specifically to addiction treatment, prevention and recovery. And then, the other thing I'd point out too, which is I don't think a lot of folks know, an Oasis program, and now Oasis is getting better about letting the programs admit people for alcoholism. But again, there's not enough resources. I can tell you already, the system itself, coming off of, it's been slow to recover from COVID, slower than most. The providers I work with in New York have upwards of a 20% vacancy rate in the positions they're trying to fill, full-time employees, because, they're inadequately reimbursed already. And so they can't serve as many people. If you do things that are going to increase, the potential for more people to need help, you're putting it into a system that can't handle the volume already. So dedicated funding from the state that should be connected to this proposal. And I think if it was, some of the folks who might not agree that this is a great idea would be, less inclined to be so vociferous. And then it really is, as you point out, an economic argument about, competition or the lack of wanting competition.
Is alcohol a harder sell because it is legal and it takes longer? It's really hard to drink yourself to death in one session. That is, if we're being frank, that's a very hard thing to do. Whereas, if there's just the tiniest bit of fentanyl in your opioid, you can keel over dead in seconds.
Yeah, and I think you hit on it.
Instantaneousness of that. One, if you're a lobbyist or a legislator who goes out and gets a martini, and okay, that drink may shorten your life by 5 seconds or 5 minutes, but is it harder to convince people who see alcohol everywhere and it's part of the culture than it is when fentanyl makes you drop dead in seconds?
Yeah, and I think that is part of, when I see folks arguing for expanding access to alcohol, it's going to produce more tax revenue that's good for the state, and it's a legal substance, and they're right. But here's the reality. Gambling's legal in states, including New York. Some people can't do it in a way where they can control their behavior. Same thing with alcohol, same things with other drugs. And so you have to assume, based on the history and the evidence, some folks will reach a point where they need help or they're going to die eventually. And by the way, because I have, family experience with alcoholism, what it does to the body over time is horrific. And so even the medical cost, I mean, it destroys your organs, and that's a very expensive, a lot of hospitalization. Again, I'm not saying do this, don't do this. I'm just saying, if you're going to do it, think it through, all the different, positives and potential negatives, and address all of them in a comprehensive way versus just going out, expanding access, assuming a system that can't manage what it's already asked to do can manage more, and not put any resources into that. And as an example, whether I think it's adequate or not, there's been investment in the OASIS system with all the expansion and gambling in New York. I don't think it's enough personally, but at least there was an acknowledgement that some folks are going to have problems doing this appropriately, are going to need help. And so let's invest some of this revenue that's coming to the state for this activity into helping those who need help because they can't control it.
In addition to treatment, what role do you believe education, alerting people in advance, what role do you think that should play, and should that be government funded as well?
Yeah, and the government does fund it. So OASIS funds a pretty robust prevention system, and it's probably the largest one in the United States. And so resources invested in the front end. Look, the time of saying to people, just, say no, or when you tell people not to do things, they do them because there must be some good reason to do it. You're just not telling me what it is. I'll figure it out for myself. No, it's more about what happens to your body if you consume too much, let alone some of the violence that occurs, especially on college campuses when there's overconsumption of alcohol. And
domestic violence. Certainly, yeah. If you look at the domestic violence rates, there's absolutely a connection.
Yeah. And again, so I live in Virginia. Wine is in the grocery stores down here. So, I personally don't drink wine, but that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not necessarily a bad thing to do. I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying, think through all the policy implications and respond in a comprehensive way.
I really appreciate it, Rob. Thank you very much. And thank you for reaching out in the first place, because this is a necessary addition to our part of the conversation.
That's it for this week. We will be back next week with more from inside the newsroom. The Eagle is a production of the Times-Union, produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall, with help from Erica Smith and the Times-Union digital team. Our music is Flyin' by Top Floor. Got questions or comments about the Eagle or any of our Times-Union podcasts? Please email us at podcast@timesunion.com.